AMG was a tuning company that was started by rogue engineers from Mercedes that had success in the motorsport world, where they took the famous 300 SEL Red Pig and raced at the 24 Hours of Spa. They took these fantastic Mercedes and then took on the world's motorsports, really made a name for themselves building these rogue AMG tuner cars, if you will. So kind of in the 70s in understated Germany, to have these super coupes and super sedans blasting on the Autobahn, they were kind of the company that was birthing, the super sedan. So they would take your normal Mercedes, modify it, and be actually really functional, doing all the German engineering and the subtleties that you will, and taking a page from American hot rodding of taking the biggest engine that they have and dropping it in the smallest car available. But everything was functional on them, which was really made them cool. It wasn't just, an aftermarket tuner kit and aftermarket tuner with body kits. Their body kits were functional. So that's one of their main tricks, was the aerodynamics. So the legendary AMG Hammer, which is kind of their pinnacle, has a drag coefficient of 0.24, which is still remarkable even by today's standards, 30, 40 years later. But they originally started as a franchise. They were based in Falterbach, Germany, and there were certain locations all throughout the world. You had AMG Japan, then you had some Middle East outfits, but the big one was AMG in Chicago, in Westmont, Illinois. So you'll have certain people refer to them as, is this a Westmont car? Is that AMG built in Chicago? So they started off, and it was founded by a gentleman named Richard Buxbaum, and don't really know how he got involved with them, but he was the CEO that started, and they would take your standard Mercedes and either modify it however you would like. If you would want a leather dashboard, custom stereo with Nakamichi sound gear, extended wood interiors, everything down to electric adjustable suspension. And then they would take what I would call their most extreme car is the AMG Hammer, when they would take a 300E, take the engine, drivetrain, and running gear, and the body kits and everything else, and rip it all apart, and then add about 500 pounds of weight, take the engine out of the S-Class, throw the cylinder heads away and the intake manifold, cast their own 4-cam cylinder heads, converting the car from single overhead cam to double, cast their own intake manifold, made all of this work with the stock Mercedes KE Jetronic fuel injection system, and effectively almost doubled the horsepower of this car. Then dropped it in the E-Class with the S-Class differential, grafted the S-Class diff to the E-Class subframe, which is a multi-link going from a semi-trailing arm, so there was a lot of engineering involved in that. Then they would do whatever else you paid for. And an interesting touch was the US cars got this steel trunk where the European cars had molded ducktails, which is kind of interesting that the US cars got a little bit nicer. But they had outfits all over the US and to varying degrees of customization. The Bruce Canepa at Canepa Motorsports was the service shop and kind of did some work as well out in the West Coast. But then there was Beverly Hills Motoring Accessories, which was a famous accessory store that would sell everything from lambswool seat covers to custom floor mats to clothing and just all the 80s persona and just period accessories that you can imagine. He was a dealer for them as well, and he sold numerous cars for them. But it was the interesting thing with AMG Chicago is the legendary people, that kind of the talent that they were able to nurture. One of their lead salesmen was the founder of WeatherTech, David McNeil, was their lead sales manager. And then AMG Beverly Hills, one of his sales manager was James Chen, who went on to form Access Wheels and a notable figure in the car world. He was involved with it, AMG Beverly Hills as well. So it was kind of the ultimate in 80s excess, taking your 80s Super Mercedes and customizing it however you would like. So when ordering your car from Mercedes, they would do it as mild or wild as you would like. They would do everything from on a standard SEL AMG to wheels, body kits, and then or as wild all the way up to, we've seen custom stereos added into the dashboards integrated on the SL 107s, where they would actually cut into the dashboard and fabricate custom stereos. There's another legendary car where one time there's a story that the CEO said, put vents on this SL. And he said, what do you, and one of the workers said, what do you mean? He's like, I don't know, just go find some vents. And they cut into the fender. They took vents from a C2 Corvette and grafted them in. So they would do whatever you wanted as long as you would pay for it. And you'll see certain cars came with custom leather dashboards, and then they would do extended wood kits, and then they would have, you could order Recaro seats. And certain cars were available with the Getrag 5-speed manual transmissions where they developed their own bell housings, but very, very, very seldom ordered. They worked with Sebring in order to manufacture the exhausts for the cars, and they did offer certain packages that, as the cars evolved, you could tell early cars because they got BBS basket weaves, and then they got the legendary AMG Penta 5-star wheels, and then the Gen 2 cars got their the first iteration of the legendary monoblock called the Aero 1s, which was a very square version of the monoblocks. And then they would offer different rear end ratios. You can get everywhere from the highway 224 to all the way up to a 327 rear end gear. But they would even do custom faceplates on the gauges if you wanted them black, if you wanted them to look standard, but rather than the standard 140 mile an hour, they would go to 200 miles an hour with the standard overlay. But they would do whatever you wanted with as long as you paid for it. So rumor has it that the most expensive car that ever left Westmont, Chicago is a famous AMG Hammer that was owned by a famous mechanic, Jonathan Hodgman of Blue Ridge Mercedes, which is the Hammer wagon. And it started life as a 1987 diesel station wagon because they weren't bringing gas into the U.S. So they took a nautical blue station wagon and took all the diesel out of it and then did the Hammer conversion. That was about $250,000, and that was one of the most extensively modified cars that we've ever seen. So it had the 6-liter 4-cam engine in it. It had a suede dashboard, extended burl wood trim throughout the car, and then it had the monoblock wheels and the first generation body kit. But what's interesting about that car is that car went back to Rentec, and then it got updates. So then it got the updated Gen 2 front bumper with the fog lights. It got 500E brakes, updated exhaust, European cams, and the AMG OZ multi-piece wheels later on. So when AMG got shut down in Chicago in around 1990, Germany was still producing parts. So very few cars did get, and it got the updated side cladding with this cool AMG cladding on the side of it. But some cars did get what they called updates, and very, very, very few did. I think only 1 or 2 cars probably got updates in the US. In terms of desirability, it's kind of a gray area because each one of these cars is custom built. In my opinion as a collector, I like to see things that are done by the original owners. So completely different story. The Lamborghini Sc30, the famous Dolphin car, I think that's cool because they were put on by the original owner and there's a cool story behind it. So in terms of originality, if it was put on by the original owner, I'd say that's okay. So in the case of this car, because it received the updates by the original owner, then it adds to the story of the car that was created at the time. I would have to say right now that in terms of AMGs, the most desirable Hammer is the CE wide body in 199 blue black metallic, kind of gray metallic over black with the Recaros and the wide bodies. We don't think any Hammers came to the United States with wide bodies. They had the S-Class, but some people are trying to say that's not a true Hammer because it wasn't the E-Class that has the S-Class engine dropped in it. So although the term Hammer can be thrown around incorrectly, what constitutes a real Hammer, in my opinion, is the 4-cam 117 in an E-Class. But to say the most valuable, I would probably say it's a tie between that CE wide body with the steel German-built wide body and the Hammer wagon, considering how original and how rare and special that car is, being the only wagon that they really built. So a standard Hammer sedan is going to run you about $750,000 roughly. Then it goes up from there based on options. We've seen some pretty significant collectors have acquired a few cars recently, and not many of them are going to pop up for sale anymore as they're moved from kind of their second and third owners to the rightful owners. There is a story of a car that's going back with its original owner, and even the little piece of tape that he wrote as a kid for his father is still on the car phone, that it is still with the car 90,000 miles later, and it's living amongst an F40 to give a scale of the magnitude. But in order to touch a Hammer, it's well over $750,000, but I'd probably have to say you're not entertaining conversation on the blue wagon for less than $1 million. So the merger happened in around 1989, 1990, and from my understanding, they just released a cease and desist letter from Mercedes corporate saying that all the franchises needed to be shut down. And there is one gentleman that ended up purchasing all the AMG parts stash, and then they've been in a warehouse in California since 1989. And some people have unsuccessfully tried to purchase parts from him, and just kind of a guy in his warehouse that knew that the stuff was valuable and tried to save it. But what's interesting is that Germany still ended up operating and building cars, and Japan, there are some later Japan cars, but the US was a hard cut in '89. In terms of maintaining these cars, some of it is exceptionally simple and exceptionally difficult. It really runs the gamut. When they forge these cylinder heads or cast these heads, the heads are exceptionally porous. And then as they got later, you'll see certain evolution of the heads where they didn't have, the early generations don't have a breather. And then they get later, then they're welded on, and then they get cast and refined. So as they got better and better, the castings evolved and got better. So you'll actually see cars that leak oil and coolant through the aluminum because it's so porous, just because the casting was so poor. So you'll pull the spark plug tubes out and you'll see coolant on the spark plugs. And it's like, where is it coming from? It's like, well, it's leaking through the head. It's like, oh, well, where? It's like, no, it's through the aluminum. And then a lot of times they will crack, and then you'll have to weld the cracks. And every time you go to weld on it, more oil and stuff comes through. So it's genuine vintage speed parts, and sourcing parts, you go run to the dealership and they have no recollection of it. So it's interesting of taking new and old technology of vintage restoration techniques, as well as 3D scanning and kind of cross-referencing and kind of making do with what you have. So every little thing of swapping springs for H&R springs and then getting the correct stickers made in the paint markings to have it look the part as well. But finding vintage AMG parts was difficult when it was new, and then now it's impossible 30 years later. But thanks to 3D printing and rapid prototyping and scanning, we're trying to build an archive of these parts in order to make them available later on.
We're here with a very special LaFerrari, and we've got a very special deal for you, our VINwiki audience today, from Glossit. Now last year, too many of you responded and you broke his website and his fulfillment process, so we've had to limit this one to just 5,000 units. But if you respond now, you're going to get their $150 graphene ceramic coating along with a $50 gloss enhancer detail spray to make the application easier than ever, along with an applicator, all for just $69.99. So check them out now at the link in the description below, and for just $69.99, get the best package of products we've ever been able to offer from Glossit.